Captain Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other pilots at Nellis Air Force Base. While her colleagues spent their free time at the officers' club swapping stories and drinking beer, Sarah could usually be found in the hangar, running her hands along the weathered fuselage of her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The aircraft had been assigned to her 6 months earlier, and, from the moment she first saw the tail numbers 810965, she felt an inexplicable connection to the machine. The A-10 was not a beautiful aircraft by conventional standards. Nicknamed the Warthog for its ungainly appearance, it was built around a massive 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon and designed for one purpose: close air support. While other pilots dreamed of flying sleek F-22 Raptors or F-35 Lightning IIs, Sarah had specifically requested assignment to the A-10 program. Her request had raised eyebrows among her superiors, but her exceptional performance in flight school and her unwavering determination had eventually worn down their resistance. Sarah's background was unconventional for a military pilot. She had grown up in a small town in Colorado, the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had served as a crew chief in the Air Force during the 1980s, working on A-10s during some of the aircraft's most challenging deployments. He had filled Sarah's childhood with stories of the Warthog's legendary toughness and the pilots who flew them into harm's way to protect ground troops. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sarah arrived at the flight line before dawn, as was her custom, to perform her pre-flight inspection personally. She trusted her crew chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, completely, but she had learned from her father that a pilot's life depended on knowing every rivet and wire of their aircraft. As she walked around the Warthog, checking control surfaces and examining the engines, she noticed something she had somehow missed before. Hidden beneath years of paint and weather exposure, barely visible in the early morning light, were faded markings on the aircraft's nose. Sarah borrowed a flashlight from Rodriguez and examined the area more closely. What she found made her heart race: ghost marks from previous unit insignia and, most remarkably, a small painted figure that appeared to be a woman in flight gear. The image was so weathered that it was almost impossible to make out, but Sarah was certain of what she was seeing. "Rodriguez," she called to her crew chief, "how long has this aircraft been in service?" The sergeant consulted his maintenance logs. "This bird's been around since 1981, ma'am. She's seen action in Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Afghanistan. Probably got more combat hours than any other A-10 in the fleet." Sarah stared at the faded image on the nose of her aircraft. Military regulations prohibited personal markings on aircraft, but this appeared to be much older than current regulations. She made a mental note to research the aircraft's history when she had time, but, for now, she had a mission to prepare for. The day's exercise was supposed to be routine, a close air support simulation over the Nevada test and training range. Sarah would be playing the role of an attacking aircraft, while F-16s from the 64th Aggressor Squadron would attempt to intercept and neutralize her. It was the kind of training that kept pilots sharp and tested the capabilities of different aircraft types against each other. As Sarah completed her pre-flight checks and prepared to start engines, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. The discovery of the mysterious markings on her aircraft had stirred something inside her, a connection to the previous pilots who had flown this same machine into combat. She thought about her father's stories and wondered if he had ever worked on this particular aircraft. The engine startup sequence for the A-10 was always impressive. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines wound up with a distinctive whine that could be heard across the entire flight line. Sarah ran through her checklist methodically, checking engine parameters, flight controls, and weapons systems. Everything was perfect, as it always was with Rodriguez's maintenance work. As she taxied toward the runway, Sarah received her final briefing over the radio. The exercise would take place in a designated training area about 50 miles northeast of Nellis. She would be given a 10-minute head start before the F-16s launched in pursuit. The scenario called for her to penetrate enemy airspace and attack a simulated ground target while evading interception. Sarah had flown similar exercises dozens of times, and she had developed a reputation among her peers for her aggressive flying and innovative tactics. While the A-10 was not known for its speed or maneuverability compared to fighter aircraft, Sarah had learned to use the Warthog's unique characteristics to her advantage. The aircraft could fly slower than most fighters, turn tighter at low speeds, and operate from shorter runways. In the hands of a skilled pilot, these limitations could become advantages. As she lined up on the runway for takeoff, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with every flight. The A-10's engines spooled up to full power, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll. Unlike the dramatic, afterburner-assisted departures of fighter jets, the Warthog's takeoff was deliberate and measured. Sarah rotated the aircraft at precisely the right speed and climbed away from Nellis at a steady rate. Once airborne, Sarah set course for the training area and began to formulate her strategy. The F-16s would have significant advantages in speed and altitude, but she knew that if she could stay low and use the terrain to her advantage, she might be able to complete her simulated attack before they could stop her. The key would be timing and positioning. As she flew toward her target area, Sarah found herself thinking again about the mysterious markings on her aircraft. Who was the woman depicted in that faded painting? What missions had this aircraft flown over the decades? How many pilots had sat in this same cockpit, facing real enemies with real weapons, trusting their lives to this rugged machine? The radio interrupted her thoughts as the exercise controller announced that the F-16s were airborne and beginning their intercept. Sarah checked her position and altitude, then began her descent toward the target area. The game was on, and she intended to prove that the old Warthog still had some fight left in her. What Sarah didn't know was that the pilot of one of the pursuing F-16s was Lieutenant Colonel James Viper Thompson, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience and more than 3,000 flight hours. Thompson had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and had an encyclopedic knowledge of military aviation history. When he caught sight of Sarah's A-10 and read the tail numbers through his aircraft's targeting system, he felt a chill run down his spine. Thompson immediately contacted his wingman, Major Lisa Cobra Chen, over their secure communication channel. "Cobra, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Check out the tail number on that Warthog." Chen focused her targeting system on the A-10 and read the numbers aloud, 810965. "Why, what's significant about those numbers?" Thompson's voice was barely controlled as he responded. "Lisa, that aircraft, it's a ghost. That's the same A-10 that Captain Elena Rodriguez flew during Desert Storm. She was shot down over Iraq in 1991, and her body was never recovered. That aircraft was supposed to have been retired years ago." The revelation sent shockwaves through both F-16 cockpits. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been a legend in the A-10 community, one of the first women to fly combat missions in the Warthog. Her disappearance during Desert Storm had become one of the war's enduring mysteries. Official reports stated that her aircraft had been hit by enemy fire and crashed in enemy territory, but no wreckage was ever found, and Rodriguez was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. As the 2 F-16 pilots tried to process this information, they watched Sarah's A-10 disappear into a canyon system below them, executing a tactical maneuver that was both brilliant and dangerous. The way the aircraft moved, low and fast through the terrain, reminded both pilots of the stories they had heard about Elena Rodriguez's flying style. Sarah, unaware of the bombshell her aircraft's identity had just dropped on her pursuers, concentrated on her mission. She had found a route through the mountains that would allow her to approach her target from an unexpected direction. The A-10's ability to fly at extremely low altitudes and its resistance to ground fire made it perfect for this kind of terrain-following flight. As she emerged from the canyon and lined up for her simulated attack, Sarah felt a surge of confidence. The Warthog was performing perfectly, responding to her commands with the precision of a much smaller aircraft. She acquired her target and began her attack run, the aircraft's targeting system painting the simulated enemy position with laser energy. But, as she pulled up from her attack and began her egress, Sarah noticed something on her radar warning receiver. The F-16s had not followed her expected route of pursuit. Instead, they seemed to be holding back, maintaining a respectful distance rather than pressing their intercept. This was highly unusual behavior for an aggressor exercise, where pilots were typically encouraged to be as aggressive as possible within safety parameters. Sarah keyed her radio to contact the exercise controller, but before she could speak, she heard an unexpected transmission on the common frequency. It was one of the F-16 pilots, and his voice carried a tone of reverence that was completely out of place in a training exercise. "Warthog 65, this is Viper 11. Request you return to base immediately. We are escorting you home." The formal language and respectful tone confused Sarah. This was supposed to be a competitive exercise, not a ceremonial escort. She responded according to standard protocol, but something in the F-16 pilot's voice told her that this was about much more than a training mission. As the 3 aircraft formed up for the return to Nellis, Sarah noticed that the F-16s had positioned themselves in what appeared to be a missing man formation, the type of flight pattern typically used in military funeral ceremonies. The realization that something significant was happening began to dawn on her, though she had no idea what that might be. The flight back to Nellis was conducted in radio silence, another unusual departure from normal training protocols. Sarah used the time to think about the day's events and the strange behavior of her fellow pilots. When they landed, she noticed that an unusually large number of people had gathered on the flight line, including several senior officers she recognized from base leadership. As Sarah shut down her engines and completed her post-flight procedures, she saw her crew chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, approaching with what appeared to be tears in his eyes. Behind him walked a group of officers and civilians, including an elderly man in a suit who carried himself with the bearing of a retired military officer. Sarah climbed down from her aircraft and removed her helmet, her mind racing with questions. As she approached the group of waiting people, the elderly man stepped forward and extended his hand. "Captain Martinez," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "my name is Colonel Roberto Rodriguez, retired. I believe you've been flying my daughter's aircraft." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at the elderly man, trying to process what he had just said. His daughter's aircraft? But that would mean the ghost markings she had discovered that morning belonged to someone who had actually flown this machine into combat, someone who had never returned home. Colonel Rodriguez saw the confusion in Sarah's eyes and gestured toward the A-10 behind her. "Captain Elena Rodriguez was my daughter. She flew that aircraft during Desert Storm in 1991. When Lieutenant Colonel Thompson recognized the tail numbers and radioed back to base, they contacted me immediately. I'd been waiting 34 years to see this aircraft again." Sarah felt her knees go weak. She looked back at her Warthog, seeing it now with completely different eyes. This wasn't just any aircraft, it was a piece of living history, a connection to a pilot whose story had become legend in the A-10 community. She thought of the faded painting on the nose, realizing now that she had been looking at a memorial to Captain Elena Rodriguez. Base Commander Colonel Patricia Williams stepped forward, her expression serious but compassionate. "Captain Martinez, we need to have a conversation about the aircraft you've been flying. There are some things about its history that you need to know, and some decisions that need to be made about its future." The group moved into a conference room in the squadron building, where Colonel Williams began to explain the extraordinary circumstances surrounding aircraft 810965. The A-10 had indeed been Elena Rodriguez's aircraft during Desert Storm, but, after her disappearance, it had been damaged by enemy fire and crash-landed at a forward operating base. Military investigators had assumed it was beyond repair and had written it off as a combat loss. However, a dedicated crew of Air Force mechanics had worked around the clock to rebuild the aircraft, believing that it deserved to fly again in honor of its missing pilot. When the war ended, the restored A-10 was quietly returned to service, but, with its previous history largely forgotten in the chaos of post-war reorganization. Over the years, it had been transferred between different units, its connection to Elena Rodriguez gradually fading from institutional memory. "The aircraft has been flying operational missions for over 3 decades, Colonel Williams explained. It's accumulated more combat hours than almost any other A-10 in the inventory. Pilots who have flown it have consistently reported exceptional performance and reliability. Some have even said it seems to fly itself in dangerous situations." Roberto Rodriguez listened to this explanation with tears streaming down his weathered face. His daughter had been declared missing in action, presumed dead, after her aircraft was shot down during a close air support mission near Baghdad. Despite extensive search and rescue efforts, no trace of Elena or her aircraft had ever been found. The family had held out hope for years that she might have survived and been captured, but, as time passed, they had been forced to accept that she was gone. "I need to tell you about my daughter," Roberto said, his voice steady despite his emotions. "Elena was born to fly. From the time she was a little girl, she was fascinated by aircraft. I was a pilot myself, flying transport missions during Vietnam, and I used to take her to airshows whenever I could. She would spend hours studying every aircraft there, asking questions about how they worked and what missions they flew." Roberto explained that Elena had excelled in school and had been accepted to the Air Force Academy despite fierce competition. She had graduated near the top of her class and had specifically requested assignment to the A-10 program, much as Sarah had done years later. Her father had tried to talk her out of it, knowing that close air support missions were among the most dangerous in military aviation, but Elena was determined. "She used to tell me that the A-10 pilots were the guardian angels of the ground troops," Roberto continued. "She said that when soldiers were in trouble, the sound of those GAU-8 cannons was like the voice of God. She felt called to that mission, to protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves."
Sarah listened to this story with growing amazement. The parallels between Elena's background and her own were uncanny. Like Elena, Sarah had grown up around aviation through her father's military service. Like Elena, she had specifically chosen the A-10 despite having the qualifications to fly more glamorous aircraft. And, like Elena, she felt a deep sense of responsibility to the ground troops who depended on close air support. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. "Sir, there's something else you should know. The way Captain Martinez was flying today, the tactics she used, the route she took through those canyons, it was almost identical to Elena's preferred techniques. I flew with Elena during Desert Storm, and watching that A-10 today was like watching a ghost." The room fell silent as the implications of Thompson's words sank in. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had developed her flying techniques through years of training and experience, but she had never studied Elena Rodriguez's specific methods. How could she have unknowingly replicated the tactics of a pilot she had never heard of until this moment? Colonel Williams broke the silence. "Captain Martinez, we need to discuss what happens next. This aircraft has been flying under false pretenses for over 30 years. Officially, it was supposed to have been scrapped after Desert Storm. Its continued service has been a bureaucratic oversight that we're only now discovering." Sarah's heart sank. She realized that her beloved Warthog might be taken away from her, retired to a museum, or perhaps even destroyed. The thought of losing the aircraft that had become such an important part of her identity was almost unbearable. Roberto Rodriguez seemed to sense her distress. "Colonel Williams, may I make a suggestion? My daughter died protecting American soldiers in combat. This aircraft was her tool for that mission, and it seems to have continued serving that purpose for more than 3 decades. Perhaps instead of retiring it, we should honor its service and Elena's sacrifice by allowing it to continue flying." The base commander considered this carefully. "Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate your sentiment, but there are regulations and procedures that must be followed. This aircraft's irregular status creates significant administrative complications." As the meeting continued, Sarah learned more about Elena Rodriguez's final mission. She had been providing close air support for a company of Army Rangers who had been pinned down by Iraqi forces near Baghdad. The Rangers were in desperate need of assistance, and Elena had made repeated attack runs despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. On her final pass, her aircraft had been hit by enemy fire, but she had managed to complete her attack and neutralize the threats to the ground troops. The last radio transmission from Elena had been to confirm that the Rangers were safe and to report that she was attempting to return to base despite damage to her aircraft. After that, all contact was lost. Search and rescue teams had scoured the area for days, but no trace of Elena or her A-10 had been found. The Ranger she had saved had requested that she be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, but since her body was never recovered, the medal had never been officially presented. "Those Rangers kept in touch with our family for years," Roberto explained. "They never forgot what Elena did for them. Some of them even named their daughters after her. They always said that she was their guardian angel, that she had given her life to save theirs." Sarah felt the weight of this history settling on her shoulders. She realized that she had been carrying on Elena's mission without even knowing it, protecting ground troops and upholding the A-10's legacy of close air support. The responsibility was both humbling and inspiring. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that the situation was more complex than anyone had initially realized. The aircraft's irregular status meant that it technically should not be flying, but its exceptional service record and the circumstances of its restoration created a unique situation. Colonel Williams explained that she would need to contact higher headquarters for guidance on how to proceed. In the meantime, Sarah was grounded pending a full investigation into the aircraft's history and legal status. The thought of not being able to fly her Warthog was painful, but she understood the necessity of following proper procedures. After the meeting, Roberto Rodriguez asked if he could speak with Sarah privately. They walked out to the flight line, where the A-10 sat in the hangar, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. Roberto approached the aircraft slowly, running his hands along its fuselage just as Sarah had done that morning. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "Elena would be so proud to know that her aircraft has continued serving all these years. And she would be proud to know that someone like you has been taking care of it." Roberto then showed Sarah something that made her gasp, a photograph of Elena standing next to the same A-10, taken just days before her final mission. In the photo, Elena was smiling confidently,
her hand resting on the nose art that Sarah had discovered that morning. The painting had been Elena's own work, a self-portrait that she had added to the aircraft during a brief maintenance stop.
Elena painted that herself, Roberto explained.
She said that every warrior should have a guardian spirit, and that she wanted her spirit to watch over the aircraft and its future pilots. I think perhaps she got her wish. As they stood together in the hangar, Sarah felt a profound connection not only to Elena Rodriguez but to all the pilots who had flown the A-10 in service to their country. She realized that being selected to fly this particular aircraft was not just a career assignment but a trust, a responsibility to carry on a tradition of courage and sacrifice. The investigation into the aircraft's status would take weeks to complete, but Sarah already knew that regardless of the outcome, her life had been changed forever. She had discovered a connection to a heroic pilot whose sacrifice had been largely forgotten, and she was determined to ensure that Elena Rodriguez's story would never be lost again. That evening, Sarah called her father to tell him about the day's events. When she described the aircraft's tail numbers and its history, Miguel Martinez was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mija," he said finally, using the Spanish term of endearment from her childhood, "I worked on that aircraft. I was part of the crew that rebuilt it after Desert Storm. We all believed that Captain Rodriguez's spirit was still with that machine, and that it deserved to fly again in her honor. I never thought I'd live to see the day when my own daughter would be chosen to fly it." The revelation that her own father had played a role in the aircraft's resurrection added another layer of meaning to Sarah's discovery. It seemed that fate had been guiding her toward this moment for her entire life, preparing her to become the guardian of Elena Rodriguez's legacy. As Sarah lay in her quarters that night, she stared at the ceiling and thought about the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. She knew that whatever the investigation revealed, she would spend the rest of her career honoring the memory of Captain Elena Rodriguez and the sacrifice she had made for her fellow service members. The ghost markings on the aircraft's nose would no longer be a mystery but a reminder of the courage and dedication that defined the best of military aviation. The weeks that followed Sarah's grounding were a whirlwind of investigations, interviews, and bureaucratic confusion. Word of the discovery had spread throughout the Air Force community, and soon Sarah found herself at the center of a story that captured the imagination of military personnel around the world. The tale of Elena Rodriguez's ghost aircraft had all the elements of a modern legend: mystery, heroism, and the supernatural connection between pilot and machine. Air Force historians descended on Nellis Air Force Base like archaeological investigators, poring over maintenance records, deployment histories, and personnel files dating back to Desert Storm. What they discovered was a paper trail that told the remarkable story of how one aircraft had managed to slip through the cracks of military bureaucracy and continue flying long after it should have been retired. The investigation was led by Colonel Michael Harrison, a career logistics officer known for his attention to detail and his ability to solve complex administrative puzzles. Harrison had seen many unusual situations during his 25-year career, but nothing quite like the case of aircraft 810965. The more he dug into the records, the more amazed he became at the chain of circumstances that had allowed the A-10 to continue flying. "It's like the aircraft didn't want to be forgotten," Harrison told Sarah during one of their interviews. "Every time the system tried to retire it or transfer it to a boneyard, something would happen. Paperwork would get lost, transfer orders would be delayed, or mechanical problems with other aircraft would create a need for additional airframes. It's almost as if some invisible force was protecting it." The investigation revealed that the aircraft had indeed been severely damaged during Elena Rodriguez's final mission. After crash landing at a forward operating base, it had been written off as a total loss and scheduled for disposal. However, a dedicated team of maintenance personnel, led by Sergeant Major Robert Chen, had refused to give up on the aircraft. Chen, now retired and living in Arizona, was contacted by the investigators and agreed to share his memories of the restoration project. He explained that the team had worked on the aircraft during their off-duty hours, using spare parts salvaged from other damaged A-10s and their own expertise to bring the machine back to flying condition. "We all knew the story of Captain Rodriguez," Chen told them via video conference. "She was a legend among the ground support community. The idea of scrapping her aircraft just because it took some damage felt wrong to all of us. We figured that if she could sacrifice her life for the mission, the least we could do was save her aircraft." The restoration had taken nearly 6 months to complete, working in secret to avoid interference from higher command levels. When the aircraft was finally ready to fly again, Chen and his team had quietly returned it to the active inventory, hoping that it would be assigned to another pilot who would continue Elena's legacy of protecting ground troops.
What happened next was a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. The aircraft's records had been so thoroughly scrambled during the chaos of post-war operations that different databases showed different information about its status. Some records showed it as destroyed, others showed it as transferred to the Air National Guard, and still others showed it as being in depot-level maintenance. This confusion had allowed the aircraft to slip through multiple audit cycles without anyone noticing the discrepancies. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself the subject of intense media attention. Military journalists wanted to interview her about her experience flying the Ghost A-10, and aviation historians sought her insights into the aircraft's unique characteristics. She was uncomfortable with the spotlight, preferring to focus on her role as a pilot rather than as the central figure in a military mystery. The attention was not limited to military circles. The story had captured the imagination of the general public as well, and Sarah received letters from schoolchildren, veterans, and aviation enthusiasts from around the world. Many of the letters shared similar themes: admiration for Elena Rodriguez's sacrifice and gratitude that her aircraft was still flying in service to the country. One letter that particularly moved Sarah came from James Mitchell, a retired Army Ranger who had served in Iraq during Desert Storm. Mitchell explained that he had been part of the unit that Elena Rodriguez had died protecting, and that he had never forgotten her sacrifice. "Captain Rodriguez saved my life and the lives of 12 other Rangers that day," Mitchell wrote. "We were pinned down by enemy fire with no way out when she appeared overhead. She made run after run against the enemy positions, taking heavy fire each time, until she had cleared a path for us to escape. The last thing we heard on the radio was her voice telling us to get to safety. We never saw her again, but we never forgot her either." Mitchell went on to explain that he had named his daughter Elena in honor of the pilot who had saved him, and that he had told the story of Captain Rodriguez's heroism to his children and grandchildren. He thanked Sarah for continuing Elena's mission and for helping to keep her memory alive. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Elena Rodriguez's exceptional service record. She had flown over 100 combat missions during Desert Storm, earning a reputation as one of the most effective close air support pilots in the theater. Her tactics had been studied and adopted by other pilots, and her innovation in low-altitude flight techniques had contributed to the A-10's legendary effectiveness in the ground attack role. Colonel Rodriguez, Elena's father, became a regular presence at Nellis during the investigation period. He worked closely with the historians and investigators, providing family photographs, personal letters, and memories that helped piece together a complete picture of his daughter's life and service. He also spent time with Sarah, sharing stories about Elena's childhood and her passion for flying. Elena always said that flying was not just a job for her, it was a calling, Roberto told Sarah one afternoon as they sat in the base library, surrounded by documents and photographs from the investigation. She believed that every pilot had a responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. She used to say that the A-10 was not just an aircraft, but a guardian angel with wings and weapons. During these conversations, Sarah learned that Elena had been working on a personal project during Desert Storm, a detailed manual of close air support tactics that she had developed through her combat experience. The manual had been lost when her aircraft was shot down, but Roberto had copies of early drafts that Elena had sent home in letters to her family. Sarah studied these tactical notes with fascination, recognizing many of the techniques as ones she had independently developed during her own training and operational experience. The similarities were so striking that it seemed almost impossible they could be coincidental. It was as if Elena's knowledge and experience had somehow been passed down through the aircraft itself. The investigation also revealed the extent to which aircraft 810965 had continued Elena's legacy of exceptional service. Over the 34 years since her disappearance, the aircraft had accumulated an extraordinary record of reliability and performance. Pilots who had flown it consistently reported that it seemed to handle better than other A-10s, that its systems were more responsive, and that it seemed to know what the pilot wanted to do before they did it. Major Patricia Webb, who had flown the aircraft during operations in Afghanistan, told investigators that she had experienced what she could only describe as supernatural guidance while flying the A-10. During a particularly dangerous mission to extract wounded soldiers under fire, she had found herself executing maneuvers that she had never trained for, as if the aircraft was flying itself. "I felt like there was another pilot in the cockpit with me," Webb explained. "Every decision I made seemed to be the right one, every maneuver worked perfectly, and we were able to save those soldiers despite impossible odds. I've never experienced anything like it before or since." Similar stories came from other pilots who had flown the aircraft over the years.
Many described feeling an unusual sense of confidence and capability when flying 810965, as if they were being guided by an unseen hand. Some reported hearing Elena Rodriguez's voice during particularly dangerous moments, offering encouragement or tactical advice. These accounts were difficult for the investigators to document officially, as they fell outside the realm of normal military reporting. However, the consistency of the stories and the credibility of the pilots who told them suggested that something unusual was indeed associated with the aircraft. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Colonel Harrison faced a difficult decision about the aircraft's future. From a purely bureaucratic standpoint, the A-10 should be immediately retired and either sent to a museum or scrapped. Its irregular status and the confusion surrounding its service record made it a liability from an administrative perspective. However, Harrison also recognized the historical significance of the aircraft and the impact that its story was having on military morale and public awareness of military service. The story of Elena Rodriguez and her continuing legacy had inspired thousands of people and had become a symbol of dedication and sacrifice that transcended individual service branches. The decision was ultimately made at the highest levels of the Air Force. Chief of Staff General Patricia Thompson, herself a former A-10 pilot, reviewed the case personally and made an unprecedented ruling. Aircraft 810965 would be allowed to continue flying, but under special circumstances that acknowledged its unique history and status. The aircraft would be designated as a heritage aircraft, a new category that recognized its historical significance while allowing it to remain in active service. It would be assigned to a special unit responsible for training new A-10 pilots, ensuring that Elena Rodriguez's tactics and legacy would be passed on to future generations of close air support aviators. Sarah would be given the opportunity to remain as the aircraft's primary pilot, with the additional responsibility of serving as an instructor and guardian of Elena's legacy. The position would require her to research and document Elena's tactics and techniques, ensuring that they would be preserved for future pilots to study and learn from. When Colonel Harrison informed Sarah of the decision, she was overwhelmed with emotion. The opportunity to continue flying Elena's aircraft while also preserving her legacy was more than she had dared to hope for. She accepted the assignment immediately, knowing that it would define the rest of her military career. The announcement of the decision was made at a special ceremony attended by Elena Rodriguez's family, the pilots who had discovered the aircraft's identity, and representatives from across the military aviation community. Roberto Rodriguez was asked to speak at the ceremony, and his words moved everyone present to tears. "My daughter Elena gave her life in service to her country and her fellow service members," he said. "Today, we ensure that her sacrifice will never be forgotten and that her spirit of service will continue to inspire future generations of warriors. I know that Elena is watching over us all, and I know that she is proud." As the ceremony concluded and preparations began for Sarah's new assignment, she realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by the discovery of Elena Rodriguez's story. She was no longer just a pilot, she was a guardian of military history and a keeper of heroic legacy. The responsibility was enormous, but she embraced it with the same dedication and courage that had defined Elena Rodriguez's own service. The ghost markings on the aircraft's nose would be carefully restored to honor Elena's memory, and new markings would be added to document the aircraft's continued service. But the most important legacy would be the tactical knowledge and warrior spirit that would be passed from instructor to student, ensuring that Elena Rodriguez's contributions to military aviation would continue to save lives for generations to come. 6 months after the discovery of Elena Rodriguez's identity, Sarah Martinez stood before a classroom of 12 newly graduated pilots at Nellis Air Force Base. These young aviators had completed their basic A-10 training and were about to begin the advanced tactical course that would prepare them for combat operations. Sarah's role as their instructor carried special significance, as she would be teaching them the techniques that Elena Rodriguez had developed and refined through her combat experience. The classroom walls were decorated with photographs and memorabilia related to the A-10's history, but the centerpiece was a large portrait of Captain Elena Rodriguez standing next to aircraft 810965. Below the photograph was a brass plaque that read, "Captain Elena Rodriguez, a guardian angel, missing in action, Desert Storm 1991. Her legacy continues through every pilot who protects those who cannot protect themselves." Sarah began each class the same way, by telling Elena's story and explaining the significance of the aircraft they would be learning to fly. She had studied Elena's tactical notes extensively, working with military historians and former squadron mates to piece together a complete picture of her innovative approaches to close air support. Captain Rodriguez understood something that many pilots miss, Sarah explained to her students. The A-10 is not just a weapon system, it's a lifeline for ground troops who are counting on us to keep them alive. Every decision we make, every technique we master, every risk we take has to be weighed against the lives that depend on our success.
The students listened intently as Sarah described Elena's tactical philosophy.
Elena had believed that close air support was as much an art as a science, requiring pilots to think creatively and adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. She had developed techniques for flying at extremely low altitudes, using terrain masking and unexpected approach angles to surprise enemy forces while minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire. One of Elena's most innovative contributions was her use of what she called guardian orbits, flight patterns that allowed A-10 pilots to maintain continuous coverage over friendly forces while conserving fuel and ammunition. These orbits took advantage of the Warthog's unique flight characteristics, allowing pilots to loiter over the battlefield for extended periods while remaining ready to respond instantly to threats.
Lieutenant Jake Morrison, one of Sarah's most promising students, raised his hand during a lecture on low-altitude tactics. "Ma'am, how did Captain Rodriguez develop these techniques? Did she learn them from other pilots, or were they original innovations?" Sarah smiled at the question, remembering asking similar questions when she first learned Elena's story.
Captain Rodriguez developed most of these techniques through necessity during combat operations. She was constantly looking for ways to be more effective while keeping herself and her aircraft survivable. Her squadron mate said she would spend hours studying mission reports and analyzing enemy tactics, always looking for ways to improve. The tactical training course that Sarah had developed based on Elena's methods was unlike anything that had been taught before. Traditional A-10 training focused primarily on weapons employment and basic tactical maneuvers, but Elena's approach emphasized the psychological and strategic aspects of close air support. She had understood that the mere presence of an A-10 overhead could change the dynamics of a ground engagement, and she had developed ways to maximize this psychological impact. One of the most challenging aspects of teaching Elena's techniques was helping students understand the level of risk acceptance that effective close air support required. Elena had been willing to expose herself to enemy fire repeatedly if it meant protecting friendly forces, but she had always calculated these risks carefully. She never took unnecessary chances, but she also never let fear prevent her from doing what needed to be done. Sarah took her students on frequent flights in aircraft 810965, giving them the opportunity to experience Elena's legacy firsthand. Many of the students reported feeling an unusual sense of confidence and capability when flying the aircraft, similar to what previous pilots had described. Sarah had learned not to question these experiences but to encourage her students to trust their instincts and learn from whatever guidance they felt they were receiving. During one particularly memorable training flight, Lieutenant Morrison was struggling with a complex tactical scenario that required him to neutralize multiple threats while avoiding civilian casualties. Sarah watched from the instructor's seat as Morrison suddenly executed a series of maneuvers that were far more advanced than anything he had been taught. The approach he used was nearly identical to one of Elena's signature techniques, despite the fact that it had never been discussed in class. After landing, Morrison was unable to explain how he had known to execute those particular maneuvers. "It felt like someone was guiding my hands," he admitted. "I could almost hear a voice telling me what to do, like there was an experienced pilot sitting right beside me." Sarah had come to believe that these experiences were real, whatever their ultimate explanation might be. The consistency of such reports from multiple pilots over many years suggested that something beyond normal military training was taking place aboard aircraft 810965. Whether it was Elena's spirit, the accumulated wisdom of previous pilots, or simply the psychological impact of flying a legendary aircraft, the result was the same: pilots were performing beyond their normal capabilities and saving lives as a result. The success of Sarah's training program soon attracted attention from across the Air Force. Pilots who had completed the course were consistently rated as among the most capable close air support aviators in the service, and several had distinguished themselves in recent combat operations. The techniques they had learned from Elena Rodriguez's legacy were proving their effectiveness on modern battlefields. Colonel Williams, who had overseen the investigation into the aircraft's history, visited Sarah's classroom regularly to observe the training process. She was amazed by the transformation she saw in students who completed the program. Young pilots who had entered the course with basic technical skills emerged as confident tactical leaders who understood their mission at a deeper level. "What you've accomplished here goes beyond training," Colonel Williams told Sarah after observing a particularly successful exercise. "You're not just teaching tactics, you're passing on a warrior spirit that these pilots will carry with them throughout their careers. Captain Rodriguez's influence is extending far beyond what she could have achieved in her own lifetime. The program's success led to an invitation for Sarah to present Elena's tactical innovations at the annual Close Air Support Symposium, a gathering of pilots, ground controllers, and tactical experts from around the world. Sarah was nervous about speaking to such a distinguished audience, but she knew that sharing Elena's legacy with a broader community was essential to preserving her contributions to military aviation. The presentation was scheduled for the symposium's main auditorium, and Sarah was surprised to see that every seat was filled. Word of Elena Rodriguez's story had spread throughout the close air support community, and aviation professionals from around the world had come to learn about her tactical innovations and their continuing relevance to modern operations. Sarah began her presentation with Elena's biography, providing context for the techniques that would follow. She explained how Elena's family background, training experiences, and personal philosophy had shaped her approach to close air support. The audience listened with rapt attention as Sarah described Elena's combat record and the circumstances of her final mission. The technical portion of the presentation focused on Elena's specific tactical innovations, illustrated with video demonstrations and computer simulations. Sarah explained how Elena's techniques could be adapted for modern threat environments and integrated with contemporary technology. The response from the audience was overwhelmingly positive, with many pilots expressing interest in incorporating Elena's methods into their own training programs. During the question and answer session that followed, Sarah was approached by Colonel David Murphy, a retired A-10 pilot who had served alongside Elena during Desert Storm.
Murphy had tears in his eyes as he thanked Sarah for preserving Elena's legacy and ensuring that her contributions to military aviation would not be forgotten.
"Elena was the best pilot I ever flew with," Murphy told the audience. "She had an intuitive understanding of close air support that went beyond anything that could be taught in a classroom. Watching Captain Martinez demonstrate these techniques today, I can see Elena's influence in every maneuver. It's like she's still out there, still protecting our people." The symposium presentation led to requests for Sarah to conduct training programs at other Air Force bases around the world. The demand was so great that the Air Force decided to formalize Elena's tactical methods into an official training curriculum that could be taught by certified instructors at multiple locations. Sarah was selected to oversee the development of this curriculum and to train the initial cadre of instructors who would spread Elena's legacy throughout the A-10 community. The responsibility was enormous, but Sarah embraced it with the same dedication that had driven Elena Rodriguez 30 years earlier. As the program expanded, Sarah found herself traveling frequently to conduct training and share Elena's story with new audiences. At each location, she encountered pilots who had been inspired by Elena's example and who were eager to carry forward her tradition of excellence in close air support. One of the most meaningful moments in Sarah's expanding role came when she received a letter from Maria Rodriguez-Chen, Elena's niece, who was graduating from the Air Force Academy and had requested assignment to the A-10 program. Maria explained that she had grown up hearing stories about her aunt's heroism and had always dreamed of following in her footsteps.
"Aunt Elena has been my inspiration since childhood," Maria wrote.
"My father always told me that she was watching over our family from heaven, and that her spirit of service would live on through the next generation. I want to fly the same aircraft that she flew, and I want to learn the same techniques that made her such an effective pilot." Sarah was honored to accept Maria as one of her students, knowing that Elena's biological legacy would now be joining her tactical legacy in the skies over future battlefields. The circle was being completed in a way that none of them could have anticipated when Sarah first discovered those ghost markings on aircraft 810965. As Sarah prepared Maria and her other students for their first solo flights in Elena's aircraft, she reflected on how much her own life had changed since that fateful morning when she had noticed the faded painting on the A-10's nose. What had started as a routine training exercise had led to the discovery of one of military aviation's most inspiring stories and had transformed Sarah from a line pilot into a guardian of military heritage. The ghost markings had been carefully restored by a team of military artists, bringing Elena's self-portrait back to its original clarity and adding new elements that told the story of the aircraft's continued service. The result was a beautiful tribute that honored both Elena's sacrifice and the dedication of all the pilots who had flown the aircraft in the decades since her disappearance. Standing in the hangar beside aircraft 810965, watching her students prepare for their flights, Sarah felt a profound sense of connection to Elena Rodriguez and to the long tradition of military aviators who had risked their lives in service to their country. She knew that Elena's legacy would continue to inspire future generations of pilots, ensuring that the guardian angel spirit that had defined her service would never be forgotten. The aircraft that had once carried Elena Rodriguez into her final mission was now training the next generation of close air support pilots, passing on her tactical knowledge and warrior spirit to young aviators who would face the challenges of an uncertain future. In doing so, it was fulfilling Elena's deepest hope that her service and sacrifice would continue to protect and inspire others long after she was gone. 5 years had passed since Sarah Martinez first discovered the ghost markings on aircraft 810965, and the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Training Program had become one of the most respected and sought-after assignments in the Air Force. Hundreds of pilots had completed the course, and Elena's tactical innovations had been credited with saving countless lives in combat operations around the world. Sarah had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and had received numerous awards for her work in preserving and teaching Elena's legacy. On a crisp October morning, Sarah stood in her office reviewing the files of her newest class of students when her secure telephone rang. The caller identified himself as Colonel James Patterson from Air Force Intelligence, and his tone immediately told Sarah that this was not a routine call. "Colonel Martinez, I need you to sit down," Patterson said. "We've received some information that's going to change everything about the Elena Rodriguez case. Are you familiar with Operation Desert Recovery?" Sarah admitted that she had never heard of the operation, and Patterson explained that it was a classified program that had been attempting to locate and recover missing American service members from the Gulf War. Recent advances in satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar technology had allowed investigators to locate crash sites and remains that had been impossible to find 30 years earlier. 3 days ago, our team located what we believe to be the crash site of Captain Rodriguez's aircraft, Patterson continued. "We found wreckage that matches the description of an A-10 Thunderbolt, and we've recovered some personal items that appear to belong to Captain Rodriguez. But, Colonel Martinez, we've also found something that doesn't make sense according to our records." Patterson paused, and Sarah could hear papers rustling in the background before he continued. "The wreckage we found shows evidence that the pilot survived the crash. There are clear signs that someone lived at the crash site for an extended period, possibly several months. We've found improvised shelters, tool marks on the wreckage indicating attempts at repair, and other evidence of sustained survival activity." Sarah felt her heart racing as the implications of Patterson's words became clear. If Elena had survived the crash, what had happened to her during the months or years that followed? Why had she never been found by search and rescue teams? And, most importantly, could she still be alive somewhere after all these years? "Colonel, we need you to come to Iraq immediately," Patterson said. "Your expertise with Captain Rodriguez's aircraft and your knowledge of her tactical methods could be crucial to understanding what happened at that crash site. We're also hoping that you might be able to shed some light on some of the items we've recovered." Within 24 hours, Sarah found herself on a military transport flight bound for Iraq, accompanied by a team of investigators, forensic experts, and recovery specialists. The flight gave her time to process the stunning news and to consider what it might mean for Elena's family and for the legacy that had been built around her story. Roberto Rodriguez, now in his 80s but still sharp and determined, had insisted on joining the expedition despite concerns about his age and health. He sat across from Sarah during the long flight, clutching a photograph of Elena and staring out the window at the landscape below. "I always believed she was still out there somewhere," he told Sarah quietly. "A father knows these things. I never felt the peace that comes with accepting death. There was always something telling me that Elena was fighting to come home." The crash site was located in a remote area of the Iraqi desert, approximately 60 kilometers from where Elena's aircraft had been shot down during her final mission. The wreckage was scattered across a wide area, indicating that the aircraft had broken apart either during the crash or in the years since. However, the main fuselage section was largely intact, and it was here that the most significant discoveries had been made. Sarah examined the wreckage with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep emotion. This was the aircraft that Elena had flown into her final battle, the machine that had carried her away from her squadron and into history. The damage patterns told a story of heroic flying under impossible circumstances. Elena had managed to keep the aircraft airborne long enough to reach this remote location, far from any enemy forces that might have captured her. Dr. Amanda Foster, the expedition's chief forensic investigator, led Sarah and Roberto to a shelter that had been constructed using parts of the aircraft's fuselage and local materials. The shelter showed evidence of careful planning and engineering skill, suggesting that Elena had not only survived the crash but had possessed the knowledge and determination to create a livable space in the harsh desert environment. Whoever built this shelter understood aircraft systems and had significant survival training, Dr. Foster explained. "We've found evidence of water collection systems, food storage areas, and even a crude workshop where aircraft parts were modified for survival use. This person lived here for at least several months, possibly longer." Inside the shelter, the team had recovered a series of items that provided tantalizing clues about Elena's fate. There were pages from what appeared to be a survival journal, written in Elena's distinctive handwriting and describing her daily struggle to stay alive in the desert while attempting to repair her aircraft's radio system. The entries painted a picture of incredible resourcefulness and determination. One journal entry, dated approximately 3 months after the crash, described Elena's success in creating a functional radio transmitter using parts salvaged from the aircraft's damaged communication systems. She had attempted to contact American forces on multiple occasions but had been unable to establish reliable communication due to the remote location and atmospheric interference.
Day 87, finally, got the radio working this morning, one entry read.
Transmitted on all emergency frequencies for 6 hours but got no response.
The signal might not be strong enough to reach friendly forces from this location. Going to try to modify the antenna system and increase power output. I will not give up. I will find a way home.
Later entries described Elena's growing realization that rescue was unlikely to come to her, and her decision to attempt an overland journey to reach Allied territory. She had spent weeks preparing for the journey, creating water storage systems, mapping her route using her aircraft's navigation equipment, and modifying survival gear for the long trek across hostile territory. The final entry in the journal was dated nearly 6 months after the crash. Day 168, radio repairs unsuccessful.
Can't wait any longer. Starting overland journey tomorrow at first light.
If anyone finds this journal, please tell my family that I tried to come home.
Tell them that I never stopped fighting.
My aircraft served me well, and I pray that she will serve others after I'm gone.
Elena Rodriguez, Captain, United States Air Force. After that final entry, the trail went cold.
The team found evidence that Elena had indeed left the crash site, taking with her a carefully prepared survival pack and leaving behind most of the aircraft's recoverable equipment. However, despite extensive searching of the surrounding area, no further trace of her had been found. Sarah studied Elena's journal entries with growing admiration for the woman whose legacy she had been carrying forward. The technical innovation and problem-solving ability that Elena had demonstrated during her months in the desert rivaled anything she had accomplished as a pilot. She had essentially rebuilt portions of her aircraft systems using primitive tools and salvaged materials, creating functional equipment that had kept her alive in one of the world's most hostile environments.
Colonel Patterson pulled Sarah aside after the initial site survey was complete.
"Colonel Martinez, we need to discuss the implications of what we've found here. If Captain Rodriguez survived for months after her crash and attempted to reach Allied territory, there's a possibility that she might have been captured by local forces or might have made it to a populated area." The investigation team had already begun reaching out to local tribal leaders and government officials to ask about any reports of an American woman in the area during the early 1990s. Iraq had been in chaos following the Gulf War, with various tribal and political groups controlling different regions. It was possible that Elena had encountered one of these groups during her overland journey. Roberto Rodriguez had remained largely silent during the site survey, but Sarah could see that he was struggling with the conflicting emotions of hope and despair. The evidence clearly showed that his daughter had survived the crash and had fought heroically to return home, but her ultimate fate remained unknown. After 34 years of believing she was dead, the possibility that she might have lived for months or even years after her disappearance was both comforting and agonizing. That evening, as the team made camp near the crash site, Sarah sat with Roberto under a star-filled desert sky. The old man stared at the wreckage of his daughter's aircraft and spoke about his memories of Elena's childhood and her determination to overcome any obstacle. "She was always the strongest person I knew," Roberto said quietly.
"When Elena decided to do something, nothing could stop her.
I should have known that a simple aircraft crash wouldn't be enough to defeat her. She was out here, fighting to come home, while we were grieving her death."
The next phase of the investigation involved a systematic search of the route that Elena would most likely have taken during her overland journey.
Using GPS coordinates and terrain analysis, the team identified the most logical path between the crash site and the nearest areas that had been under Allied control during the time period in question. The search was complicated by the fact that 3 decades had passed since Elena's journey, and the political landscape of the region had changed dramatically multiple times. However, the team was assisted by local guides who had extensive knowledge of the area's geography and tribal history. On the third day of the expanded search, the team made a discovery that sent shock waves through everyone involved. In a small village approximately 40 kilometers from the crash site, local residents showed the investigators a shrine that had been maintained for over 30 years. The shrine was dedicated to the angel woman who had appeared in their village during the troubled times after the war. Village elder Mahmoud al-Hassan, who had been a young man during the early 1990s, told the story that had been passed down through his family. According to his account, an American woman had arrived in the village in the spring of 1991, severely injured and near death from dehydration and exposure. The villagers had taken her in and nursed her back to health, despite the risks involved in helping an American during that chaotic period. She was like no woman we had ever seen, Al-Hassan explained through an interpreter. She was strong and brave, but also gentle and kind. She helped our village in many ways while she was recovering from her injuries. She shared her knowledge of medicine and mechanics, helping us repair equipment and treat sick children. The woman, who the villagers had called Malik, Arabic for angel, had lived in their village for over 2 years. She had learned to speak Arabic and had become a valued member of the community, using her technical skills and medical knowledge to improve life for the villagers. However, she had never stopped talking about her desire to return home to her family in America. Al-Hassan showed the investigators a collection of items that had belonged to the American woman, military identification tags bearing the name Elena Rodriguez, a pilot's wings pin, and a photograph of Elena standing next to aircraft 810965. The proof was overwhelming. Elena Rodriguez had not only survived her crash but had lived in this remote Iraqi village for years after her disappearance. What happened to her? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Al-Hassan's expression grew sad as he continued his story. In 1993, during the troubles with the government forces, Malik tried to help some of our young men who had been injured in fighting. She was caring for wounded people when government soldiers came to the village. They took her away with them, and we never saw her again. The revelation that Elena had lived for over 2 years after her crash, helping and healing people in a remote Iraqi village, added yet another chapter to her extraordinary story. She had survived not only the crash and months in the desert but had found a way to continue serving others even as a prisoner in a foreign land. Roberto Rodriguez wept openly as he held his daughter's identification tags, the first physical proof he had ever had of her fate. The knowledge that Elena had lived and had continued to help people even after her ordeal brought him both comfort and renewed anguish. She had been so close to finding a way home, only to be taken away again by circumstances beyond her control. The investigation team immediately began working with Iraqi government officials and international organizations to trace what might have happened to Elena after her capture in 1993. The political situation during that period was extremely complex, with multiple government agencies and military units operating with little coordination. Finding records from that era would be challenging, but not impossible. However, the team's efforts were interrupted by an unexpected development. As word of their discoveries spread through the local community, an elderly woman named Fatima approached the investigators with a story that would change everything once again. Fatima had been a nurse in a government hospital in Baghdad during the 1990s, and she claimed to have treated an American woman who had been brought to the hospital under military guard in 1993. The woman had been suffering from injuries sustained during a bombing raid, and Fatima had cared for her during the final weeks of her life. She was the bravest woman I ever met, Fatima told the investigators. Even as she was dying, she was concerned about others. She taught me medical techniques that I had never learned in nursing school, and she helped me care for other patients who had been injured in the war. She made me promise to tell anyone who came looking for her that she had died with honor, helping to heal others. According to Fatima's account, Elena Rodriguez had died in the Baghdad hospital in late 1993, approximately 2.5 years after her aircraft had been shot down. Her final words had been a message for her family, asking them to forgive her for not finding a way home and to remember her as someone who had tried to serve others until the very end. The news of Elena's death was devastating for her father and for everyone who had been inspired by her story, but it also provided a sense of closure that had been missing for over 3 decades. Elena Rodriguez had not died instantly in an aircraft crash, as everyone had believed. Instead, she had survived against impossible odds and had continued to serve and protect others for years after her disappearance. Sarah realized that the discovery of Elena's true fate would require significant changes to the memorial program that had been built around her legacy. However, the core message of Elena's story, her dedication to protecting others and her refusal to give up in the face of overwhelming challenges, was actually strengthened by the knowledge of what she had endured during her final years. As the investigation team prepared to return home with Elena's remains and personal effects, Sarah stood one last time beside the wreckage of aircraft 810965's sister ship in the Iraqi desert. She thought about the aircraft that she had been flying for 5 years, carrying Elena's spirit and legacy forward into a new generation of pilots. The ghost markings on the nose of aircraft 810965 had always represented Elena's presence with the aircraft, but now Sarah understood that Elena's true ghost was not supernatural but inspirational, the continuing influence of her courage, dedication, and compassion on everyone who learned her story. Roberto Rodriguez had asked to spend a few private moments at his daughter's crash site before departing. Sarah watched from a distance as the elderly man knelt beside the wreckage and spoke quietly to his daughter's memory. When he finally stood and walked back toward the waiting helicopter, his face showed a peace that had been absent for 34 years. "She's finally coming home," he told Sarah as they prepared to leave. "And now I understand why her aircraft kept flying all these years." Elena's spirit wasn't trapped in that machine, it was free, inspiring others to be brave and selfless like she was. The aircraft was just the messenger, carrying her legacy forward to new generations of heroes. As their helicopter lifted off from the crash site and began the journey back to civilization, Sarah looked down at the harsh desert landscape where Elena Rodriguez had fought her final battle against impossible odds. She knew that Elena's story would continue to inspire military aviators for generations to come, not just because of her heroic flying, but because of the extraordinary courage and compassion she had shown during the most difficult period of her life. The Elena Rodriguez Memorial Training Program would be expanded to include not only her tactical innovations but also her example of never giving up hope and always finding ways to serve others, even in the most desperate circumstances. Aircraft 810965 would continue to fly, carrying Elena's memory and legacy forward, but now everyone who flew it would understand that they were honoring not just a fallen pilot, but a woman who had embodied the highest ideals of military service throughout her extraordinary life. Elena Rodriguez had finally returned home, and her legacy would continue to soar.